And welcome back, Professor Almeida, jpalmeida.com. Welcome to part 2 in our lecture on arguments. If you missed part 1, you can go back and watch that and come right back here. We'll be waiting for you. With that said, let's jump right in and let's talk about identifying syllogisms. And you're probably wondering to yourself, what on earth does that mean? Well, fear not, because we're going to get into it. So here are our key topics for this lecture. We're going to go over the 4 key points of syllogisms. A syllogism is a type of argument arranged in 3 parts. You have a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. As a matter of fact, you have already seen an example of a syllogism in part 1 of our lecture. So once we define what a syllogism is, we're going to look at the 4 key points: validity and truth, soundness, ambiguity, and we'll get into enthymemes. So let's define what a syllogism is. It's a type of argument arranged in 3 parts. You have a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. Remember that Socrates example I showed you in the last lecture? All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Take a moment to identify the premises and the conclusion. So, what are the 2 premises in this statement? As a matter of fact, what is the major premise and what's the minor premise? What is the conclusion? So let's break this apart. We have our major premise. All men are mortal. Right? All men are mortal. Our minor premise, Socrates is a man. So what is the difference between a major and minor premise? Well, we'll get to that in a second. But you've probably guessed that the conclusion here is that Socrates is mortal. So what are the key points? The major premise is the more general premise. Okay, so all men are mortal. That is our major premise. The minor premise is that Socrates is a man. So if the major premise is true and the minor premise is true, then the conclusion follows logically from it. Does this make sense? And if it does make sense, feel free to hit that like and subscribe buttons. Okay, so there are different types of syllogisms. The first one is what's called the categorical syllogism. This is formed with a categorical proposition, or propositions, excuse me. All geologists are scientists. Some geologists are tall. Therefore, some scientists are tall. A hypothetical syllogism takes the form of if-then. If I pass this course with a B, then I will retain my scholarship. The last one here is what's called the disjunctive syllogism, and includes an either-or statement. Either the concert tickets are in my desk or they are in my wallet. So now that you know what a syllogism is, let's talk about validity. Syllogisms are assessed in terms of validity. We are examining the structure of the argument. Now, whether or not an argument is valid has nothing to do with whether the premises of an argument are actually true or not. So you need to understand that. This is also deductive in nature, and we also have to ask ourselves, does the argument adhere to the principles of logic among its premises? If the argument is structurally correct, the argument is logical and valid. So we're not concerned of whether the premises are true or not. Let me give you an example here. Everyone born in France can speak French. Okay, so that's our first or major premise. Barack Obama was born in France. Okay, therefore Barack Obama can speak French. Okay, so obviously Barack Obama was not born in France, so that premise is not true. But in this case, we don't care about that. It's still a valid argument. Why? Because when we assume the truth of the premises, everyone born in France can speak French. Barack Obama was born in France. the conclusion must be true because it logically flows from the two premises. Let's look at another example and ask ourselves if this argument is actually valid. The major premise here: the World Cup soccer tournament champion is chosen from among the finalists. The minor premise: the 4 teams in the World Cup soccer semifinal matches this year are all from Europe. And the conclusion, therefore, the World Cup champion this year will be a European team. Is this argument valid? Again, we don't care here if the major or minor premises are true. Does the conclusion logically follow from the two premises? Okay, so let's look at this again. The champion is chosen from among the finalists, right? So the championship game, you have your 2 finalists. The 4 semifinal teams are all from Europe. And based on those 2 premises, we conclude that the champion will be a European team. Okay? Whether or not the premises are true, the conclusion logically follows the 2 premises, and therefore this argument is valid. Now let's look at truth. Truth is concerned with the content of the argument, whether or not the premises are accurate. Okay? We analyze matters of fact within statements. And again, it's important to note that arguments can be valid with false premises, just as we did with our example with President Obama, or former President Obama. So let's ask ourselves if this argument is true. The major premise: if all mice are green. The minor premise: and Mickey Mouse is a mouse. Conclusion: that Mickey Mouse is green. So remember, when it comes to validity versus truth, this argument is still valid, but is this argument true? Okay, so think about that for a second. Because now we need to talk about the soundness of an argument. Now, with soundness, you need to understand, with a sound argument, it's a valid argument. Okay? It's established only when an argument is valid and its premises are true. It's determined by establishing the truth of its premises. So you need to understand this. All sound arguments are valid arguments, but not all valid arguments are sound arguments. Okay? You also need to understand that it can't be done by logic alone, and you need to have empirical evidence from observation or experience. So let's take this example. The World Cup soccer tournament champion is chosen from among the finalists, right? That's our major premise here. The minor premise: 3 of the 4 teams in the World Cup soccer semi-final matches this year are from Europe. So remember, a sound argument is a valid argument that has all true premises. Therefore, the World Cup champion this year will be a European team. Okay, so think about this. Is the argument valid? And if the argument is valid, is this argument sound? Okay, remember what we talked about, what sound arguments are. So what do you think? Do you think this argument is sound? Okay, I'll leave that to you to think about. So let's go over a couple of other examples. Women from the Middle East are human. Humans have rights. Therefore, women from the Middle East have rights. How about this example? All birds have wings. A dove is a bird, therefore a dove has wings. Finally, all women like to shop. John likes to shop. John must therefore be a woman. So remember what we talked about: validity, truth, and soundness. So my question to you, are these arguments sound or unsound? Let's go over a couple of other examples. All birds lay eggs. A chicken lays eggs. A chicken is a bird. If Lucinda smokes cigarettes every day, she increases her risk of lung cancer. However, Lucinda doesn't smoke cigarettes every day, therefore Lucinda has no increased risk of lung cancer. Well, this syllogism appears logical, but what if Lucinda's husband is a chain smoker? So think about that. Again, I ask you, are these sound or unsound arguments? Now, you have a couple of exercises in the OER textbook, and you can go over these in Chapter 1. I'm looking at exercise 5 on page 22, for example. So you can try out those exercises for yourself and determine whether the arguments in exercise 5 are valid by using the informal test of validity as I have shown you in these past few slides. Now let's talk about ambiguity here, because language can cause problems for syllogisms. And let's take an example here. Here's a major premise. Things detrimental to student learning should be eliminated. The minor premise, tests are detrimental to student learning. Conclusion, therefore, tests should be eliminated. Is this a valid argument? Is this a sound argument? What do you think is wrong here? Okay, so there are two things that we need to look at. So while the syllogism is valid, the conclusion is not certain. So one thing you need to understand that with validity, we're not concerned with whether the actual premises are true or not. The conclusion has to logically flow. So again, this is valid, but we're not certain about the conclusion. Why? Because we need to look at the word detrimental. How detrimental? Okay? How detrimental? Also, we need to look at tests. What kind of tests are we talking about here? So we need to define what we mean by detrimental. Detrimental how? What kind of tests? So the conclusion here is not certain because it's ambiguous, right? The premises are ambiguous. So let's try another couple of examples. Are these examples valid or invalid? Saudi Arabia supports terrorism. The United States supports Saudi Arabia. Therefore, the United States supports terrorism. Is this valid or invalid? Well, the syllogism appears both valid and sound, right? Remember what we talked about with sound arguments. The term support here opens the door to ambiguity. What do we mean here by support? Does this make sense? Okay, and if this does make sense and it does help with your reading, again, feel free to hit that like and subscribe button. So again here, we see that while this syllogism is both valid and sound, at least by first glance, the term support opens the door to ambiguity because we don't know what is meant by support. How does Saudi Arabia support terrorism? What do we mean by support? How does the United States support Saudi Arabia? Can we make that conclusion then that the U.S. supports terrorism? Okay, so it's a bit ambiguous. So in summary, a syllogism is valid or logical when its conclusion follows from its premises, right? When its conclusion falls from its premises. A syllogism is true when it makes accurate claims. The information it contains is consistent with the facts. To be sound, a syllogism must be both valid and true. Syllogism may be valid without being true or true without being valid. Okay, so I'll leave it right there, and hopefully this lecture helps you out a bit. Again, this covers Chapter 1 in the OER textbook, Intro to Logic and Critical Thinking. So go back into your reading, go through the exercises. You do have an answer key in the back, by the way, and make sure that you understand the differences between validity and soundness. Anyway, that's about all. You do have a discussion post in COSA 2. Go check that out in Canvas. Again, feel free to hit that like and subscribe button. We'll see you in the next video. Good luck.